Welcome to Fast Keto. I'm your host, Ketogenic Girl. Hey guys, welcome to this week's episode of the Fast Keto podcast. I had the pleasure of having our keto biohacking doctor on, Dr. John Limansky, and we talked about so many fascinating aspects of keto on today's episode. I think you guys are really going to enjoy this one. We talked about his 90-10 high-fat diet experiment he's doing this week, my carnivore diet experiment that I'm doing, and the science behind so many different aspects of fat burning and ketosis, having ketones, high ketones, low ketones, blood sugar, insulin, all these various hormonal effects of keto, of doing these different trials of elimination diets, how to properly do elimination diets and reintroduce foods. We talked about all of the latest health tech and biohacks, and I really had such a blast recording with John today. So I hope that you guys enjoy today's episode with Dr. John Limansky. If you haven't checked out my cookbook yet, it is called Keto Essentials on Amazon, and it is currently 42% off on Amazon. It has over 150 of my favorite keto recipes, all of the most delicious comfort foods that I have made into keto treats, everything from fettuccine alfredo, keto pad thai, my spinach and artichoke dip, cheesecake, brownies, decadent, delicious, healing, and healthy recipes to get you started on keto. And I make them all super simple. All the ingredients you can find at any supermarket. I don't use a lot of hard to find ingredients. I like to be able to make these recipes using ingredients from any supermarket, any grocery store. And there are a few keto products in there that you might want to try at some point, like those weird noodles. But you know what? You can make all keto foods and recipes from my book without having to get any rare and hard to find ingredients. It is called Keto Essentials. It's on Amazon for 42% off. Go and get yourself a copy and get a copy for everyone you know, because hey, keto is amazing and you know it is. So go check it out, and hope you enjoyed today's episode. A few disclaimers. By listening to this podcast, you agree not to use this podcast as medical advice, as I am not a qualified healthcare provider. The information presented on this podcast is for educational purposes only. Ketogenic Girl is not qualified to provide medical advice. Consult your own physician for any medical issues that you may be having. This entire disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to this podcast. Prior to beginning a ketogenic diet, you should undergo a full health screening with your physician to confirm that a keto diet is suitable for you and to rule out any conditions or contraindications that may pose risks or that are incompatible with the ketogenic diet. A keto diet may or may not be appropriate for you if you have any kind of health condition, whether known to you or unknown. So you must consult your physician to find this out. Anyone under the age of 18 should consult with their physician and their parents or legal guardian. It's great to have you back on the show with us this week, John. How's it going?
Hey, Vanessa. Thanks so much for having me back on. It's always a pleasure.
It's bright and early there for you.
Yeah, I'm on my circadian rhythm, so I wake up usually 4:30 in the morning over here in California. So for me, I'm ready to go.
Do you have to set an alarm for that, or are you naturally waking up with the sun?
Yeah, I actually wake up a little bit before the sun rises. I don't use an alarm clock because I don't want to have my cell phone near me, and that's what everybody uses for their alarm clock these days. So it's pretty natural. I'll wake up between 4:30 and 5. I do go to bed earlier because I am getting old, which my wife likes to make fun of me, but it works. I feel more productive in the morning, so I get a lot of things done before my kids wake up. So it works very well for me.
And then you naturally go to bed when the sun sets or fall asleep?
Yeah, I'm pretty regular. Usually it's by 10 o'clock at the latest.
Yeah, because the sun right now in Prague is setting around like 10 o'clock at night.
Yeah, I love those summers in Europe or the Northwest or Northeast where, it's 10:30, 11 and the sun is still up. I've set up my bedroom where I can make it really dark. So generally here right now the sun is setting around 9 o'clock. So it's usually dark by the time I go to bed.
That's nice. It sounds like you're really aligned with that. And I have a question later on time-restricted eating and when you close your eating window for the day.
Definitely.
Which I'll get to in our questions. But I was just making my new favorite coffee, which is coffee just with collagen in it. Normally, I would also put cashew milk in it, but I'm doing carnivore, so I'm being good and skipping that part of it. But it still tastes surprisingly good just with collagen, just plain, the gelatin. And you were saying that you put some collagen in your coffee as well?
Yeah, I've been doing that for a while, probably 5 years now, I would say.
That's amazing.
I like the texture it gives you, plus also, the support function of all the collagen. Obviously, if you're eating carnivore, you're getting a lot of collagen from the meat that you're eating. But I actually like it. It gives you kind of a nice frothy texture to it, and it really gives you a good amount of collagen for us who don't eat a ton of meat. So it works very well, I think.
Right. I can't believe how frothy it makes it. So in Prague here, I go to a cafe a few times a week that I work from, and they make their own cashew milk in-house. So they make these amazing cashew milk cappuccinos. But when we were at KetoCon, I went to this great little spot nearby. I'll give them a shout out, Picnic. And they need to put the collagen in their cashew milk drinks to make it frothy. I guess because they're using like a store-bought brand. But I really liked it, and I've been starting to incorporate it. And I like just having that. It's kind of a nice change from doing coconut oil and just having collagen. And I'm amazed at how creamy and frothy it is, just with no nut milks, no oil or anything, just a little bit of the collagen. So it's really interesting. I want to learn more about it. I just listened to a podcast this morning that had, I think, Sarah Ballantyne on it. She was talking all about collagen. The properties of it are just incredible. I mean, it's just got so many great health benefits to it. So is that why you started using it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as we're getting older, we need to repair a lot of our ligaments, tendons from overuse. As you mentioned, there's many, beneficial health properties from it. I find it lacking in a lot of things that I eat at this point. So for me, it was really a question of how do you optimize your health? And, there's really limited downside or really no downside in consuming collagen. I think part of the reason that bone broth is becoming so popular is obviously the collagen that you get from it and vitamins and etc. But so I find it to be quite a good little hack that you can use to improve your health. That's really why I started using it.
Yes. Now, when I first went keto, I had my slow cooker going on, constantly making bone broth. And it was nice because you could just go up to it any time of day and just pour yourself a serving, and it would always be nice and warm. But it made our whole house smell like bone broth, like constantly. And we had a couple of cats at the time with us, and they were just going like stir crazy because it always smelled like chicken bones. And I gotta say, just having the powdered collagen is so much easier. I want to learn a lot more about it. And on the podcast I listened to this morning, I think Sarah was saying that it also has glutamate in it. And that's what gives us our umami sense. And I absolutely love foods with umami. The whole secret behind Italian cooking I've learned is umami because it's in tomato paste, anchovies, and truffles. And those are the three main ingredients for pretty much everything they make outside of gelato. It's basically just umami culture. And then, it's in bacon and all those salamis and cured meats and stuff. But I really find I'm drawn, to bacon, to truffle, to all these glutamate foods, mushrooms, tomatoes, soy as well, like soy sauce. So we were talking a little bit about the difference between glutamate, which is an excitotoxin, and the difference between glutamate and MSG, monosodium glutamate. So we want to usually avoid MSG.
Right.
For various reasons. But is glutamate ever a concern?
First of all, you're kind of killing me with all these descriptions of food because I'm doing, this 90 to 10 high fat to protein. So basically all I'm eating is fat. So you just rattled off all these things that I'm like, oh, that sounds so good. I need to have some anchovies.
Right. I'm on carnivore, so it's okay. We're in the same boat.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, I mean, glutamate, obviously is a very important component of normal function. And, it's used as the most important neurotransmitter in terms of excitatory transmitter. It's a non-essential amino acid that actually doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. And so you have to generate it inside the brain cells from glutamine and other precursors. It's really important as a precursor for GABA as well. And so it's a very important component of a healthy diet. But what we normally get it in as MSG. And so MSG is obviously a very, very kind of ubiquitous product that's used mostly in fast food restaurants and Chinese restaurants. And the difference is that the way it's produced. So if you look at actual MSG, the way it was kind of found was actually in Japan as a chemist who started experimenting with different food flavors. And what happens is something called isomers. So any chemical compound that you look at has basically mirror images of themselves. So one is called D, one is called L, and it's the way that it's configured. So when you make MSG in a chemical kind of way, it's actually something called D-glutamic acid. And what happens is it's actually a free floating molecule. The normal L-glutamic acid, which is the one that our body normally produces or we consume, is actually bound to a protein. So a couple things happen in order for the body to utilize MSG. So when you eat something, let's say you just do shots of MSG. I don't know why anybody would do that, but let's say you did do that.
Right.
Yeah. So it's not actually bound to a protein. And so you get a rapid absorption into your bloodstream. And that rapid absorption causes a lot of the negative side effects, right? So it's this thing where it's so much a neurotransmitter, very excitatory neurotransmitter, and you're getting a massive surge of it. And that's really part of the negative downside. And that's why it's associated with like migraine headaches and depression and all these different components. When you're eating it in the natural form, it's actually going to be the L-glutamic acid that's bound to a protein. So it takes a while for the body to actually, enzymatically break it down and utilize it. And that's really why it doesn't have this toxic property that MSG does. Problem is MSG is in everything. I mean, we associate it with, Chinese food, but it's really in a lot of different fast food. And it's very hard because it's not necessarily labeled as MSG on the menus. They don't label it like that. They'll say, natural flavoring or something to that effect.
Modified food starch.
There you go. Yeah. So it's this game that they play with labeling, so you don't actually know what it is. And actually, if you think about it, it's not required by the FDA to be declared on the label. So you have no idea. And that's why I try to avoid things.
I find in so many products, especially those, we call them kind of frankenfoods and junk food products. You'll see modified food starch in almost every single one of them. And it's such a cheap way of making food taste really good because you get that glutamate, excitotoxin reaction in the body.
Exactly. And actually, it's actually in things that you wouldn't think of. So like whey protein, which a lot of people use, it can be in that.
Wow.
And we were just talking about collagen. Well, some of them may have MSG in it. I don't know. Barbecue chips, anything that's like this imitation soy sauces will have it because it's basically a way to get your brain to really like whatever you're consuming that has it in it. So it's very, very addicting properties of MSG. So that's the difference between that and just the naturally occurring, L-glutamic acid or glutamate.
Ted Naiman has a theory that the reason that people get cravings for umami foods is because our bodies make such a priority of having protein, and protein has a lot of umami in it. I wonder if you're getting it, say, in your Caesar salad dressing with lots of anchovies, if you're getting it in, soy sauce without MSG added, tamari, if you're getting it in all these different products like truffle, black truffle, and these concentrated forms. I think Parmesan cheese has the highest concentration of glutamate of any food in the world. That's why we love it so much. If you're getting it in those forms, then it's not harmful.
Yeah, no, I think at that, in those concentrations, again, it goes back to how rapidly things are absorbed in the bloodstream. And so you have to actually break it down to utilize it. So, I don't think that you're going to eat so many Parmesan crisp or Parmesan cheese to overdo it in terms of the toxicity of glutamate. The body is very, very good at self-regulating, except that we just try to overwhelm it by the way that we consume things. But in general, the body is going to be very good at deciding how much it needs. It's when we start chemically manipulating things and then we can, deliver this massive dose very quickly, that's when we start having issues, I think.
That's so interesting. And it makes me feel a lot better because all my favorite foods tend to have umami or glutamate in them.
Nice.
And I'm glad to know that you can eat them in healthy ways because, anchovies in pasta, Caesar dressing, all those things. I'm probably talking about them a lot because I'm on Carnivore, as you know, doing this 30-day trial. And I'm curious because you said you would be open to trying Carnivore yourself, but you're not a big meat eater. So how would that look for you? A lot of collagen?
Yeah. I think probably no. I'm not opposed to trying experiment. I know you've been at me for quite a while because you've had such a great experience on Carnivore, and I think because so many people are doing great on it. I'm not opposed to it, and I'll be the first to say I've followed kind of Sean Baker's group and seen the results that people are having. And I think a lot of it has to do with, number one, people approaching Carnivore from like just a Western diet. So You eliminate all the processed foods, all the carbs, all the bad oils, and you just start eating meat, which if you think about it, if it's the right type of meat, it's basically a 1-to-1 ratio of protein to fat. And so in terms of grams, but if you break it down in terms of percentages, it's really kind of a ketogenic way of eating in the sense that you're basically 70% fat and 30% protein. So you're definitely getting the benefit of being in ketosis, maybe not, very, very high levels of ketosis, but you're also eliminating. It's almost like an elimination diet, which you and I have talked about before. And you brought that up, and I think it's a very good point where a lot of us have food allergies and we don't know what they are. And so we could be eating a ketogenic diet with, let's say eggs or dairy as the main kind of component of it to hit the fat ratios and still not be feeling as great as possible. And maybe that's because we do have food allergies to one of those things. So by doing carnivore, you're basically saying, okay, I'm going to get rid of everything except meat. And most people are just doing, beef as their way of eating meat. And so you're eliminating all those other things. And so I agree with you that maybe you're getting some gut healing properties and that down the road, you could probably introduce something else to maybe kind of liberalize what you're doing.
Amber O'Hearn was saying she thinks with the latest research coming out from this institute in Hungary, is it all has to do with the gut connection and correcting leaky gut.
Right. And again, when we start talking about the gut, I'm going to be late to the party on this because I don't know. I mean, we have so much research about gut flora and different types of gut flora. I don't know what to make of it at this point because there's so much research coming out, but I don't know how to put it together yet. And I think anybody who's saying, well, I know definitively what the gut microbe is doing, I'm not sure if we're there yet. But having said that, yeah, I do think you're going to have improvement in gut function, improvement in gut lining, because you're basically getting rid of a lot of the toxins that are associated with that. Obviously people are feeling better. Arthritis is getting better. Depression is getting better. So a lot of things that we know are kind of linked to gut microbe and leaky gut and function like that are getting better. So it makes sense that this is definitely going to improve in certain ways, and it's probably due to, partially gut flora. But then you'll have on the flip side, researchers will look at gut flora that doesn't actually get fiber. And yeah, you're getting some fiber from the meat. And they're actually showing that some of the gut microbes are not doing as well as they should be. So I don't know, there's a lot of conflicting data on that. And that's why I'm not ready yet to really definitively say this is what's happening.
I agree with you. There's so much information coming out every day about it. And it's still so new that it's still to be in the process of forming an opinion about it, I think makes sense because there's just so much data coming out all the time.
Right. Yeah, and I think also in terms of the carnivore benefits, something that I've been focusing on lately is really satiety, satiation, and then nutrient density. I think you're getting a lot of that satiety from the nutrient density of the meat because, obviously it's a very, very nutrient dense kind of way of eating. So I think that's part of the benefit as well. But the question I would have in terms of long-term studies, we don't know yet. Is eating meat for 50 years something that's healthy overall? I don't know that answer, and I don't think anybody does yet. The flip side would be that people say, well, from a carnivore, from an ancestral perspective, we've been eating meat. That's what allowed us to really survive and thrive. But we're eating kind of the whole animal. And so I'm wondering if, instead of just eating ribeyes, would it be beneficial to actually eat more of the organ meats? And you and I have talked about that before. I think you would get a lot more nutrient-dense food as well by doing that. And I don't think people who eat carnivore are opposed to that. I just think it's harder to get, organ meats, especially in the United States.
Yeah, I think of it a little bit in the same way as being a vegetarian and doing it responsibly and being a carnivore and doing it responsibly. I mean, your nutrient requirements are going to differ from person to person, but people that I've spoken to who've done carnivore for multiple years, like Amber O'Hearn, 9 years now, she makes a real effort to get in those organ meats and to eat, nose to tail. And I think that's really, really important. And it's very interesting to me. I think the main reason I agree with you, I think you brought up such a good point that the main reason people are getting all these benefits like lowered inflammation, lack of cravings, increased energy, lack of bloating, greater strength, libido, enhanced mood, all these things. I know for me, like when I went off a high carb diet and I started doing fasting, I started getting a lot of these same improvements. And it was the same thing with keto. And going fasting or carnivore, you're just eliminating a lot of foods that could potentially be causing issues with you that you don't know about. So this time, one of my biggest motivators for doing the whole 30 days, it was to use it as an elimination protocol. And I'm going to actually really properly do the reintroductions the proper way. So I'm going to reintroduce one carb per week. And there's a specific way. I just had Christina Kerp on my podcast last week. She wrote a cookbook. She's a Castaway Kitchen. She wrote a cookbook. It's just like an AIP keto paleo approach. And she explained very clearly that you have to introduce one thing at a time. And at first, just a little bit, like a few slices. And then you monitor over a day to 3 days. And then you add more and you monitor over the whole week. And you see how your body's.
And what are you monitoring?
Well, if you're looking, for example, for most people, it has to do with inflammation and any kind of autoimmune reactions. So like I know for me with gluten, I get autoimmune reaction as soon as I have any in my diet. It takes 2 days. But if I wasn't waiting those 2 days, I might think, oh, I did fine after 1 day. But it's really, for me, it's always 2 days after. So getting the most value from any kind of elimination diet is doing the reintroductions like one at a time. So I think that's something that you can do. So I've got a list of all my favorites going, the first week I get to reintroduce avocado and the second week, this. And just to observe, I think it'll be interesting to observe and learn things. And that's what I love about keto and all this biohacking and testing and feedback is we get to learn so much about our bodies and how they respond to what we actually put in them, instead of just reading, oh, this thing is good for you. It has antioxidants, eat it, as opposed to actually testing. So that's going to be really interesting. So how's your high fat experiment going so far?
Yeah. So today is day 3 and, I eat mostly high fat anyways.
Mm-hmm.
I would say probably 75% to 80% of my calories are usually fat based. So obviously it's a little bit higher. So what I'm doing is a 7-day, 90% fat to 10% protein, because I really want to kind of address this question of satiation and satiety. And so there's an argument that it's protein that really makes you have both. Then there's the flip argument that it's actually fat. The reality is I think it's a combination of those two plus, nutrient density. But I wanted to see this experiment. And so basically what we're doing is we're keeping it isocaloric to the 7-day high protein experiment that I did with Jimmy Moore. So far, I feel pretty good. Interestingly enough, I think my ketones this morning were 0.5, which for me is very, very low. Usually I run in the 2s, 2 to 3 area. I had to eat very late last night just based on, the day was very busy. Normally I won't eat late at night. So if I, didn't have a chance to actually eat dinner 5 or 6, I just won't eat. I'll just fast versus eating late.
Right. I was going to ask you what time you usually close your eating window.
Yeah, usually I try by 6 o'clock. Most people, I'll tell them, 3 hours before you go to bed. So for me, I'm usually in bed by 9 or 10, but I find it to be the best in terms of how I feel. And so why is it important? Kind of closing your window. Our organs have a circadian rhythm to them. And so this is something that I think is extremely fascinating, and research is really coming out, mostly from the Salk Institute with Dr. Panda, looking at how the body actually is able to utilize food based on a circadian rhythm, based on ancestrally how we were kind of developed. And one of the things that I've been able to show is that if you do time restricted feeding, meaning you basically eat, within an 8-hour window, and you stop earlier in the day, you can eat, the same amount of calories and actually lose more weight than somebody who's eating ad libitum, meaning they're eating all day with the same calories. So the calories don't matter in that sense. Plus, when you eat very, very late at night, you inhibit melatonin production in your pancreas, which I think is fascinating. And melatonin is really what allows you to access those deep sleep areas, which are extremely important, because you get into this vicious cycle where, let's say you eat very late at night, so you don't sleep very well that night. So then the next morning you have high levels of cortisol, high levels of norepinephrine, high levels of my favorite hormone, the ghrelin hormone, which basically stimulate your hunger levels. And so then the next day you're very hungry, you eat all day, maybe you eat late at night again, so you don't sleep well. And so you get into this vicious cycle that I find that if I really kind of stop my eating by 6 o'clock, I do much, much better. And there's a lot of studies that are showing that the production of leptin and ghrelin are based on also your sleep habits. So if you don't sleep very well, or you don't sleep more than 5 or 6 hours, what happens is you actually will inhibit leptin production, which is the hormone that really makes you feel full, and you'll increase the ghrelin hormone, so you'll be stimulating appetite.
Can we just rename it to gremlin officially?
I think we should. Gremlin hormone. It's so much better because it's like this hormone that just basically stimulates your appetite. So I'm gonna try to trademark that and see if we push it. It's just easier to say.
But that was my favorite biohack from your presentation. And I didn't realize that. I mean, I had heard Dr. Panda talk about how that melatonin production starts around 3 hours before your usual bedtime. So if you want to be as aligned with circadian clock as possible, then you want to stop eating around 3 hours before. But I didn't realize that you were kind of then stimulating less melatonin, more ghrelin, and then the next day it sets you up, to be a hangry gremlin.
Exactly. No, this is what's so fascinating about nutrition and biohacking, as you mentioned before, is that as we start learning more from a research perspective, you can actually look at how it impacts your body. And so I track a lot of measurements, data points to see, hey, if I do this, what happens to my sleep? And I will tell you 100%. If I eat late at night, I don't sleep very well. I don't get the deep sleep. My heart rate is higher, meaning that it's more sympathetic tone. And then the next day, I'll feel it. My glucose will be higher in the morning when I fast. I will be hungry all day. And so it's really this blending of science and actual experience that I think is fascinating.
That's great. So you close it every day around 6. So back to your fat experiment. I mean, you normally do 75 to 80, but even going from that to 90% is a big difference.
It's a big difference, actually. And part of the issues, the negative side effects of doing experiments like this, obviously we're doing it because we want to kind of put a discussion out there, kind of like what you're doing with all your podcasts and your work, is putting a discussion out there, what actually happens, so that when people come to this kind of way of eating, there is not only clinical research and lab research, but there's also personal experiences that people can look at and say, okay, this is what I can expect. And so that's part of the reason that we're doing these experiments. But yeah, really increasing by 10 to 15% and decreasing the protein, which is mostly what I will eat, and very little carbs, is a challenge. And part of the things that I find challenging is I can't eat certain things that I really enjoy. I'm limited in terms of what I can eat in terms of bone broth with the ghee, pork belly, which I'm a big fan of pork belly for very short periods of time. I wouldn't be able to eat pork belly the rest of my life, as my staple part of my food. But in terms of how I feel very good. I feel energetic, brain function is good. My sleep is very good. So those things are positive.
Well, it's also kind of monotonous, I guess, because the way it sounds like your meal plan is being repeated every day.
Yeah, because it kind of has to, because unless I'm going to just basically, chug olive oil, doesn't sound really appealing. And it really kind of defeats the purpose of what I'm trying to show. We wanted to make a point of not just doing MCT oil, butter, or ghee as the only thing that we consume, because then that's, number one, not realistic. Nobody's going to live the rest of their life that way. And number two, it's this rapid absorption, of liquid fats that I'm concerned about, that I see a lot of people consuming in terms of their bulletproof coffee, et cetera. That I didn't really want to just do that. I wanted to try to do something where it's a little bit more slower absorption. I actually have to chew it, so it's more realistic.
Right. And what are you hoping to learn? I know that you put out a really interesting question on your Instagram, which has to do with gaining more satiety or satiety from eating more fat, but then at the expense of burning more stored body fat or losing less fat if your goal is ultimately weight loss.
Right. So there's two main questions that I think need to be addressed and are what I'm really focused on right now. And kind of like you mentioned earlier, we're constantly learning things. So I'll be the first to admit that every day I learn new things. When I listen to your podcast, when I listen to other podcasts, read books, I'm still learning new things. But one of the things that I think is fascinating at this point is this idea of satiation and satiety. So satiation is basically, as you're eating your meal, how long does it take for you to actually feel full? Satiety is how long after you finish that meal do you start feeling really hungry again? And so there's two separate kind of components. And the question I have is, is it really fat that's driving this? Is it protein consumption, as Dr. Naiman or Ted Naiman would say? Is it nutrient density, as somebody like Marty Kendall would say? I don't think it's one macronutrient per se. I think it's the ratio and the combination of the way that you consume it. And then you look at really kind of the hormonal regulation of both of those things, satiety and satiation. And there's many different things. We've already talked about leptin. We haven't talked about insulin yet, or glucagon. There's also the gremlin hormone that we talked about. But then there's other, kind of peptides that are produced by the stomach and the small intestine. So things like CCK, PYY, those things are definitely going to be impacting your hunger levels and this question of satiety versus satiation. So that's kind of what I want to show also. Having done the high protein, now doing the high fat, we might do an experiment where we just do very, very nutrient dense food just to see which one is really affecting us in a positive way. And the way to measure that for us would be really subjective at this point, because there's no real good objective way. I mean, I could go to the lab and test my leptin and gremlin hormone levels, but that's not realistic. So I'm going to look more in terms of, timing for me. How long does it take me to really get full during a meal? How long until the next meal do I really feel full? And kind of measure that. So I can tell you with the protein experiment, I would be full for about 30 minutes and then I would be starving again. So doing a very, very high protein for me there was good satiation, but there wasn't good satiety because I was hungry right away. So that's really kind of why I posed that question of, which is it that really makes you have control over hunger? Because that's the question, right? So if for most people who are new to ketogenic or low carb, high fat, they're mostly coming to it for weight loss. But how do you lose weight if you're hungry all the time? Hormonally, you just can't do it. I mean, it's very, very difficult. So really kind of honing in on what is it that's actually controlling our hunger, because that's a very, very important part of the question, I think. And then the second question I posed was, so if you're consuming a lot of exogenous fat, right? So you're basically consuming fat, are you inhibiting your body's ability to access endogenous fat? So your body fat stores. And that's another question. And the answer really is you're not. But the argument that a lot of people will have is, well, if you're obese and you're trying to lose weight, you should not eat fat. And I don't think that's the right way to approach it. Obviously, if you're consuming, 5,000 calories of fat and you're trying to lose weight, well, that's not going to happen because there still is this energy homeostasis, right? So we can measure our BMR, our basic metabolic rate. I can measure kind of how much calories I actually utilize throughout the day because I do a lot of exercising. So for me, I could probably consume up to 4,000 calories a day and maintain energy homeostasis, meaning that I wouldn't gain weight, I wouldn't lose weight, I would be kind of at stable. But not everybody can do that. And so that's the question that people have to answer for themselves is, number one, what's my BMR? So what's like the basic energy requirement I need just to maintain normal function? And then add into that, well, how much energy do I expend by walking, by exercising? And then kind of figuring out calorically also how much calories they should consume, because that isn't a part of the question. That's part of the equation in terms of weight loss and health management. So those are the questions that I'm really interested in at this point. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer to your question.
No, it's so interesting. And there are those two questions. And it seems like the answer on the second one is somewhere in between the two, because we know that, from like you were mentioning the Salk Institute, where they had these mice on the same diet, but they just had them, with time restricted eating, that they were losing more weight than the ones who were eating later into the day and night, even though they were eating the exact same calories. Their energy intake was maintained, but there was fat loss with the time restricted eating. And we know that in between meals and in that fasting window that you have daily, that you're able to burn stored body fat and you're able to burn, the calories that you're eating and intaking. But at the same time, there are fundamental laws of physics as well, where like if you are, like you said, eating too many calories, eating more than you expend, then at some point you're going to gain weight. But all of this has really been thrown up in the air because we've seen some experiments. Like, I don't know if I'm getting the name right. It was maybe Sam Feldman did this experiment where it was like he did 5,000 or 10,000 calories a day, but eating low carb, high fat, and he didn't put any weight on.
Yeah, I think it was him. Anything that you do for short periods of time, I think obviously you can have, good results. I do think it's fascinating, this concept of kind of ancestrally our fasting and feasting periods. And so if you actually look at biochemically what happens, one of the reasons that this time restricted feeding, as you mentioned with the rats, is so powerful, intermittent fasting, long-term fasting, is that we developed kind of biochemical processes that you have to have periods of fasting to actually activate the enzymes, the kind of pathways to start utilizing the fat, especially your fat stores. And so when we're always eating, even if it's like the 6 meals a day and snacking, you never allow your body to have these periods where it can actually activate the pathways that it needs to basically burn fat. And so really part of what I think they're showing now with research is that when you kind of time restrict, you have periods of the day where you're consuming food and you use that food for energy. But then you have periods of the time where you're not eating, where you actually are able to activate enzymes to start using your own body fat as energy. And that's why it takes a while for people to convert when they go from a Western diet to keto or low carb, high fat. It takes a while. That's why you go through kind of the keto flu, but also why it takes a while for your ketone production to ramp up is because your body actually has to start utilizing and making these enzymes so that you can actually start burning your own fat stores. And that, I think, is part of the very interesting question of why time restricted feeding, intermittent fasting, long-term fasting is so powerful for us.
Hey guys, just taking a really quick break to talk about the 28-day Ketogenic Girl Challenge. If you're interested in doing a ketogenic diet for yourself, it's a great place to start. I teach you everything about how to follow a keto diet to get yourself into nutritional ketosis, and it includes 28 days of meal plans. It comes with weekly shopping lists, how to interpret results, how to test yourself, a complete guide to getting started on keto. If you've been keto for a while and you're just not getting the results that you want to in terms of your health or fat loss, or you are brand new to keto, the 28-day challenge is a great option because it also comes with my free coaching and support in our members Facebook group, and you can post any questions that you have about the meal plans, about keto, and I am there supporting you. We have an amazing community in our group. I like to call it the happiest place on earth because everybody in there is so excited about following keto, about having found something that really works well for them. And everyone in there is just so kind, caring, generous, and supportive. And it's a really fun place to be and hang out. So if you'd like more info on it, you can find it at ketogenicgirl.com. And it's the 28-day Ketogenic Girl Challenge. And now back to our interview. Right. And I think what's so interesting about some of those studies they've done with the rats is that they were not feeding them very healthy diets. So imagine if, they were to do it with keto diets, what kind of results that they would see between the two. I think it would be really, really interesting. They're probably doing that already, or it's in the works.
Yeah, I know that they're definitely focusing on it. What they traditionally will do is more of a high fat chow, but that is, very, very pro-inflammatory.
Yes.
And usually has high sugar component to it. So it doesn't really kind of mimic, it'll say high fat, but it doesn't mimic kind of a keto or low carb, high fat diet like you and I would consider.
I feel like you should do one of those Sam Feldman experiments and see how many calories on keto you could eat without gaining weight.
Well, I know Robert Sykes is doing 6,000 calorie per day for 6 months experiment. Yeah, he's going to maintain his kind of ketogenic ratios. Yeah. So I'll let a younger, healthier Robert test that experiment, and then we'll see what comes out of it. But yeah, I agree with you. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I didn't know that. That'll be interesting to follow and see. I would do it, but it's just not in my goals to be putting on tons of fat because I'm not like Robert Sykes and I can't just go burn it off with all my muscle tissue easily.
Exactly. Well, I was just going to say, I'm glad you bring that up because it also goes to the point of, should I do something like Sam Feldman? Well, or should you do something like that and do a very high caloric intake? Well, we're not all built the same. So you and I are definitely linear. We do have, muscle mass, but we're not going to be big bodybuilders. And so we're going to respond very differently than somebody like Robert or Danny Vega or, people who have more muscle mass. So it really goes to the point of individualizing kind of your nutrition and exercise and biohacking plan based on your body type, but also how old you are. All those factors come into play. So it's not like one size fits all, unfortunately.
I don't see you liking the idea of eating all that food at all, especially, coming from the mindset that you do now. I want to ask your opinion. I saw a post that Ted Neiman did today on Instagram, and he showed, so there's this following that people have for long-term longevity diets where it's a restricted calorie model because there have been all these rat studies that show that rats or mice, is it always rats or mice? I'm not sure which ones. I kind of use them interchangeably. So I'm not sure which ones were used in these experiments, but that the ones who are on a generally calorie restricted diet that eat lower calorie, they live longer. So in the long term, it's theorized that if you do sort of an OMAD, 1 meal a day approach long term, that is better for you for your longevity. And it makes sense when you think about it. You have less for your body to break down, and it's just less stressful for the body, more fasting. But so Dr. Neiman did a post today saying that these studies, to him, the conclusion is just that the rats or mice who are eating less, like eating lower calorie diets, were just dying slower, not living longer.
Yeah. So, most of the original studies have been on caloric restriction because, like you mentioned earlier, law of physics. So we always thought that calories in equals calories out. And whether you eat more calories than you use or less calories than you use, that kind of determines whether or not you gain weight or lose weight or are healthy. And I think really what the research is showing now is that caloric restriction in and of itself is not really the solution. It's more of this time restrictive feeding where you give periods of time where you're consuming really healthy, good, nutrient dense food, high protein, high fat. Carbohydrates are not necessarily the devil in this, but eating really high quality food and then not eating for periods of time. And that is really showing, more in terms of longevity, but also how you feel. Ask any person who is calorically restricting. Obviously, you can't ask mice or rats this question, but most people who are trying to lose weight are on a calorie restricted diet. It doesn't matter, what the diet is. That's essentially what they're doing. They're basically lowering the caloric intake, assuming that you're going to lose weight because of this idea of law of thermodynamics. The problem is with caloric restricted eating is that people feel horrible. They don't necessarily lose much weight. They might lose a little bit of weight initially, but they're really affecting the metabolism in ways that are very negative. And so one thing I would say is taking mice rat studies and extrapolating that to humans is a big stretch to begin with, but we do have a lot of data in terms of caloric restricted diets in humans, and that's really what the impact is they don't feel good, their markers are not necessarily great, longevity is not improved. This time restricted feeding is really, I think, the way to go, and it's one of my favorite hacks because the research is really showing that, number one, markers get better. Number two, you feel better because you're utilizing your fat stores. Number three, hormonally, you're kind of getting regulation over things, assuming that when you eat food, it's really the nutrient dense, high quality food that you and I are describing. So I love Ted because I think he's really pushing the envelope, really pushing the question of protein dilution. Basically, this idea that what we have increased in our society is really bad flours, really bad carbohydrates, bad oils at the expense of protein. And because of that, people are getting sicker, fatter, more unhealthy. I agree with Ted in the sense that I think protein is essential. And I will say, after really talking to him and looking at the research that he's kind of brought forward, I've increased my protein intake. Obviously not during this 7-day experiment, but in general, I've increased it somewhat and have felt great. So I think I agree with him in terms of, how do you interpret some of these studies that are caloric restricted? I would say that we should move on from caloric restriction and go more towards time restricted feeding, intermittent fasting, things like that.
Right. And I was going to ask you how you were doing with higher protein because I know that you were doing that a bit, because I have to say that that has been all these experiments that we do, you learn so much from doing them. And for me, doing this carnivore thing, part of it's been the elimination protocol, but the biggest thing that I've learned is that I can eat so much more protein than I thought I could and be in a deep state of ketosis, because this time I'm doing it more. I'm doing the ratios closer to my typical keto diet. Before I was like really upping the protein. This time I'm keeping it moderate, but I can still go higher and still add more of that nutrient density from protein while keeping the carbs a bit lower. And after I'm done the carnivore, I'm going to keep the protein higher and lower the carbs, because I'm not going to do carnivore. I'm going to incorporate carbs into my lifestyle. Like, carnivore is just not for me long term. I love avocados and coconut and dark chocolate and cashew milk and all those things way too much. And life, needs to have pleasure and variety and color and all these things, not just for nutrition, but just for enjoyment of life as well. I'm definitely going to opt for higher protein levels. And I think that's the best thing that's come out of this carnivore trend.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a couple things. You have a fantastic cookbook. So I find it kind of ironic that you come up with this cookbook with all these amazing meals and then you go carnivore. So I'll give you props on that. But I think the question to me is, which we have not answered, is how much protein is enough? How much is too much? So the takeaway that I got from my very high protein experiment is I know that if you push it too high without the balance of fat, for me, the way I feel is horrible. So that's the takeaway. But what I would say is, so my lean body mass is about 150 pounds. The range that we give people in terms of how much protein they should consume really varies from, the low end, which is like 0.3 grams per kilogram, to the high end, which is like 2 grams per pound of lean body mass. So all these different metrics, I would say for me, it's probably somewhere of 1 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight for me. So that's about 80 to 90 grams of protein per day. That's what I would say. So that's kind of my takeaway. Was I was doing probably around 60 to 70 grams of protein. I definitely increased it somewhat. And by doing that, I wouldn't say I noticed a change in satiation and satiety per se, but I did notice, increased muscle mass. I did start lifting a little bit more and doing less of the cardio, just based on what I was trying to accomplish with my body. So I did notice some positive things from that.
You gained like a pound of muscle, didn't you, when you did the trial?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, about 1.5 pounds. So there you go. All I have to do is just eat nonstop protein and not do anything. I'll be jacked, I guess. I'll be like Danny.
Well, that's what what, the bodybuilding community is always focused on, eating lots and lots of protein and stuff. Yeah, it is pretty ironic that I released this cookbook and now I'm doing carnivore, but I can't help it. I'm a biohacker at heart. Like, kind of.
I know. I just had to give you a hard time.
It's pretty funny to see some people's reactions when I talk to them and they're like, what on earth are you doing? I'm like, I know that I'm on the right path, because I know when I first started keto, I got the same kind of reaction. So, I think it's just part of being a biohacker, being an early adopter and stuff, and, being into testing and doing all these different things. And I'm so happy that I've done it, even though I can't wait to be reincorporating carbs, just because of what I've learned about protein. And I have had no bloating or inflammation. For me, has always been something that I've just accepted as being a part of life. And now I'm like, wow, on carnivore, I don't have any. So I think there are some vegetables that do cause like excessive bloating and inflammation for me. And it tends to be my favorites. I think I have some suspects. I think it's like the cabbage, especially. I just love raw cabbage, but is it worth it to be bloated for 6 hours afterwards and be uncomfortable? Like, that's one of the things I've really enjoyed about carnivore. So there's so much to learn from it. I think it's cool for everyone to try like these wacky things. And, like you're doing with your experiment too, like with 90% fat, like it's not easy to do. Like I've seen pictures of your guys' meals and like, I'm sure they taste delicious, but like it's a lot of fat. Like just like with anything, like I know when you were doing your high protein, that's why I'm enjoying carnivore this time, is because I'm moderating the amount of meat. Like I don't think I could eat that much meat or that much fat. Like you almost have not a gag reflex, but like, it's just not on those high levels. Like, it's just not something sustainable. So, I'm sure you guys are going to learn a lot from it. I really can't wait for your podcast on Friday to hear everything that you guys learn, especially because you're doing so much testing.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a good experiment. I think for you, I'll be fascinated to see when you start reintroducing things into your, eating, what the reaction is, especially with cabbage and things that you might think are suspect. It'd be fascinating to see how you react.
And the nightshades, I think I'm going to test one at a time because those come up so often for people. And I've always resisted testing them because I love nightshades, like especially eggplant and peppers. They're such wonderful foods, like in the summer when you're grilling, and I'm like, nah, like paprika, like chipotle, like there's no way I could have reactions to these. But, I'm going to test and record it and kind of see how it all goes. So that'll be really interesting too. I want to talk about the concept of chasing ketones quickly. I've seen a lot of dialogue about this lately, and saying, well, you shouldn't be chasing ketones and like, you shouldn't care about having high ketones and all this stuff. And I get really high ketone readings, right. And I attribute some of that maybe to my biology, physiology, but a lot of it is because I worked really hard to figure out keto in a way that I would get those results that I wanted. And I know at the end of the day that they're just numbers, but if you want the therapeutic effects that come from ketones, a lot of those benefits of being on a keto diet come when you have high ketones. So like some of the brain, the clarity, the mental clarity and sharpness that you get, some of the benefits in terms of lowered inflammation because ketones have anti-inflammatory effects. There's all these benefits to being fueled to a large degree from ketones, where I don't think people should just say, well, don't chase ketones because it doesn't matter. I do think it's important to have low and consistently low blood glucose, but if your body, on the flip side, if you're not getting really high ketones, it doesn't mean that you're not in ketosis and that you're not, or you can't experience any of these benefits. You may just use them really, really efficiently. So when you test, there's not a lot circulating. So there's two sides to it. But in your opinion, what level for most people of ketones, like is 0.5 enough? Is below 0.5? Are you still getting any benefits? Like, what's your opinion on all that?
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up this question because I think it's very relevant and an important question, important discussion. So a couple things on the way I kind of approach ketosis. Number one, for me, it depends on why you're doing a ketogenic, low carb, high fat. Why are you measuring ketones? Some people that I work with will absolutely just not check ketones. They won't check glucose. They just don't care because they can measure how they feel and they're losing weight, and that's all that's important to them. For people who are using this more as a therapeutic kind of way of controlling symptoms, so if you have seizure, epilepsy, traumatic brain injury, cancer, autoimmune diseases, anything that really, really depends on production and utilization of ketones to kind of mitigate those symptoms, I think it's extremely important to check and to document kind of where your ketones are. Having said that, right now I'm really very, very interested in breath ketones because when you're checking blood, you're checking beta hydroxybutyrate, but there are different ketone productions, ketone bodies that are formed. We can only really measure in the blood the beta hydroxybutyrate. And so that's a very, very small reflection of overall ketone production. When you check the breath, you're basically checking breath acetone levels, and that tells you the utilization. So, because that's the breakdown product of actual utilizing ketone bodies. So that gives you a much bigger perspective of, okay, this is what my body is actually making, and this is what's actually using. So I'll actually measure blood and breath pretty religiously these days because I want to know kind of that ratio. And there's no good correlation saying if your blood is this, you can expect your breath to be this. It gives you kind of an idea of what am I making, what am I using, and then I'll reflect that with my glucose and be able to kind of see overall what I'm doing, how it's affecting my body. In terms of what's like the base number for therapeutic reasons, Finney and Volek will say, well, it's 0.5. And I would say that in my kind of clinical experience, I don't really see a benefit for most people unless it's around 1. I would say for myself, if I don't see, if I'm below 1, I can tell, from a brain cognition standpoint, I don't feel as sharp. I do have more hunger levels. My glucose is usually higher. So for me, it's more around at least 1 and usually higher. But But I think what's happened is because we can kind of measure this value, people, it's almost like a bragging contest. Well, my ketones were 5, my ketones were 7, whatever. And that doesn't necessarily mean anything, because are you really utilizing those ketones, or are you just producing them and then excreting them? That's the question I think people should really kind of focus on. So instead of, really being a contest of, well, I'm making way more ketones than you are, it doesn't really matter. It's what's effective for you at a certain range. What are you actually utilizing, which I think is extremely important. And that's kind of what I would, advise most people to look at.
See, what I find really interesting is that the measure of ketones just in the blood is always what's left over after you have used the ketones that your body has made from stored body fat, and sometimes also the fat that you're eating. But why would the body make more ketones than necessary? Like, say when you're fasting, everyone's ketones levels go double, triple. Like, I have ketones off the charts when I'm fasting, doing extended fasting. So why is it that the body would make so many more than is needed? Is it just like you would think it would be making them on demand as needed?
Yeah, so the blood is really just a snapshot in time. So you're kind of trying to see circulating ketones at that point, but you're also just checking the blood. You're not able to look inside the cells and see what actually is being utilized. Basically, there's a misconception that glucose is bad and that we don't want any glucose, and all we want are ketones and fatty acids. So when you go into a fast, extended fast, well, the reason your body is really kind of ramping up the ketone production is because you do have that energy demand. You are measuring in the blood, a certain amount of actual ketones that are circulating. But if you were to do an extended fast and measure your breath ketone, your breath acetone, you will see that number is off the chart. So to answer your question is, your body is utilizing those ketones. There are some circulating in the blood, and that's what you're measuring. But if you actually were to measure your breath, you would get a much better analysis of how much is actually being utilized. And that's why I think it's so much more powerful to measure it that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It definitely does. And I think, it's really interesting. And it'll be interesting to see when you and Jimmy conclude your experiment too. Like, for example, why are your blood ketones so much lower when you're ingesting all this fat?
Yeah, and I think here's the question I'll try to answer is that, so the last 2 nights, because of kind of the way my days have been, I've been eating very, very late at night. So not very late, but for me, like 8:30. So that goes against what I really normally will do. So tonight, I'm going to try to do it. Obviously, it's 4th of July, so that might be hard, but I'm going to try to do it where I eat, normal, and then see what my ketone production is in the morning. Because it's been very low, but I think part of that has to do with, well, I'm still basically digesting and utilizing the fat that I consumed. And so that's why my ketone production has been lower.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it'll be really interesting to catch all of your conclusions at the end of your experiment. And it's always fun to follow you guys when you're doing these. I get really pumped about seeing, the various conclusions, the questions that come up, and then, the analysis that you guys do. So it's your guys' podcast is my favorite that's out there right now. I really look forward to each episode every week. And for anyone who isn't listening or subscribed yet, it's a Biohacking MD podcast with Jimmy Moore and John Limansky. And if you want Dr. John Limansky, and if you want to follow in the next few weeks, you'll see, the results and the analysis, the post-game analysis as well after that. And you said that after that, you're going to do a fast for a bit and then you might try carnivore.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. You've been convincing me. You've been hounding me, maybe is a better word. So I tend to like to do a fast after every experiment that I do, just to kind of reset things. And then I'm not opposed to doing carnivore. People are having such great experience. I'm getting a lot of questions. So in general, what I like to do is have experience with things like that. So I can actually talk to people and say, well, this is kind of what you should expect. This is my experience. So I'm not opposed to doing it. And so I'll give it a shot just for you.
Awesome. I can't wait to see what you think of it and your conclusions, and if you moderate protein or bump it up and see what it does, with your blood glucose and ketones. Like I know you did high protein before, but carnivore keto is different, especially when you keep the protein, moderated. I saw that you put a Freestyle Libre on. So how's that going? And was it painful to put on as opposed to the finger pricking?
Yeah, so the Freestyle Libre is basically a flash glucose meter. So it's not a continuous, meaning you have to take the sensor and put it over the receiver, which I'm pretty OCD, so I check it, every 30 seconds or so. But
oh, that's good.
So to answer your question, it's very, very simple to put on. Doesn't hurt at all. You don't even feel anything. And basically, it's a needle that is implanted into your tricep, and it has a sensor, and it takes about 12 hours to kind of calibrate. And then once you have it in, you can keep it for 10 days and basically check your glucose whenever you want. So when I do experiments, I love to have it on there because, obviously I don't want to stick my finger, 20 times a day. And I want to really see the impact of what I'm doing on, obviously blood and breath ketones, but also glucose, which you and I have talked about before. And I think glucose, especially fasting glucose, is one of the best kind of tests that you can do to just kind of measure overall health. So I think it's a great kind of addition. And I know a lot of people are starting to use them. I hope that as more people get used to it, that they'll become, a little bit cheaper and maybe people don't have to have a prescription. So right now in the United States, you have to have a doctor's prescription to get that. Luckily, I can just, do it for myself if I need to. But I know in Europe, you can buy them.
Well, I ordered one in Canada, but I ordered one this week because I want to start using them. But what's crazy is I went first on the UK website to get it, and they are almost out of them. They're only allowing people who are currently registered. And I think that's to protect diabetics. And it's crazy because I went on eBay and I was bidding for one just because UK is closer. And then I was like, wait, I'm not going to bid on this. Like if someone is on here, they might be needing it for their condition, and I'm just doing it for biohacking. So I was like, I'm not going to bid on this. Obviously, there's a big demand for them. And, there really is such a need for more of these testing tools because I saw even a headline yesterday that diabetics were having trouble. Was it in Australia getting the urine test strips because of all the keto dieters?
Right. So I saw that too in Australia. They're having a hard time not only getting the urine, but also the blood ketone strips because of all the people who are doing a low carb or keto diet and wanting to measure.
Yeah, I order my ketone strips from Australia because there's a pharmacy there that I kind of worked out a deal with a few years ago when I started doing this professionally, and they limit me. Like I remember when I first, started, I was like, oh, can I get this many? And they're like, nope. We are very, they almost ration them. And I understand why they do that because there's obviously people who need them a lot more for life and death reasons. But there's a huge demand for these products. People need to, open businesses and start making more of them. It's great to see some of the groups you're working with, like a Level and other groups who are developing more of these testing. I'm just waiting for the Google, contacts that will show you your blood glucose continuously, because that's the ultimate, just to be able to know everything that you're doing and how your body's responding to it.
Yeah, there's a couple things that I've been talking to some people who are in the kind of business that I really want put out there. Number one, a continuous ketone meter would be amazing. Oh, wow, yeah. And then a way to check, insulin, which apparently is going to be one of the more difficult things to do. But if we can get like a at-home insulin kind of measurement, that I think would be a game changer.
Oh, yeah.
And then you wouldn't have to really check glucose and ketones as much because you could basically use that as your metric of, where you're at. But yeah, I think more people are coming to the realization that it's important to track. Obviously, we don't want to affect people who have to track, just to make sure that they don't get very sick. I think as there's more demand, more companies will come into the market. There's Keto Mojo who does a great device. As you mentioned, there's Level, there's Ketonics. So there's a lot of, anytime there's a good business opportunity, I think more businesses will come in and obviously kind of level the playing field. So I think you'll see that in the next 5 years, there's going to be a lot more supply out there than than we have right now.
Insulin testing at home would be incredible. And I know like it might be even more useful for people who are just doing keto, say for fat loss, and wanting to create like an insulin scarce environment. It doesn't matter maybe as much for them, the ketone production, but maybe more just having really low resting insulin and how they can optimize their diet for that could be, fascinating. But I have no idea how it's measured or how that would be done at home. But do you think think it's going to be possible?
Well, I think it's going to take a big company like Abbott or one of the bigger companies to do it, because there are some challenges with measuring insulin from what I've been told. Number one, it's a peptide, so it's very unstable. Number two, you need a lot of blood because of the way that you test it. So right now, if you're doing like a finger stick, it's just one drop of blood. Most people are okay with that. But if you were to ask somebody to say, okay, prick your finger and then basically bloodlet yourself for 50 cc's, most people are not going to do that. So that's part of the problem. There's a lot of different like step reagents that have to be done specifically, like at different times in order to actually measure it. So there's a lot of kind of technical issues with it at this point. I do think that if more people are kind of demanding it, and I would actually say it would be a better test for people who are metabolically sick versus just trying to lose weight, because that I think would be extremely important for them to be able to measure kind of where their insulin is depending on what they're doing, in terms of like not only dietary things, but lifestyle things, biohacking things, because that's going to impact it as well. But we'll see. I mean, I think the future.
Would there be any way to measure glucagon?
Yeah, that is a very, very difficult one to test. So you can measure it in a lab setting. I know Dr. Bickman, obviously is doing a lot of research with that. And I don't know if it's going to be a practical one for us, like as lay people, to be out and testing glucagon, because a lot of these, so glucagon and insulin, they have kind of a relationship with each other, kind of an inverse relationship, but they also have a lot of factors that influence when it's actually in the bloodstream. So measuring it versus what's actually happening at a cellular level may not be very accurate, meaning that, you can check it in your blood, but the effects are really going to be at the pancreas and liver. So are you actually measuring what's happening there versus what's happening in the blood? And I think that it's not necessarily giving you the accurate information, if that makes sense.
That does. And I look forward to all these future testing methods coming. I think it's just going to make the way that we're doing things now look so archaic, just so much guesswork, and so much of that's coming from this testing. So I wanted to mention your videos. I know you're doing a lot of them. We did a video together in Austin, KetoCon, and where can people catch your latest videos and follow your content?
Yeah, and that was a great interview. Thank you for doing that. So what I'm trying to create, because I get a lot of the same questions from people, and I'm also interested in answering a lot of these questions from the experts. So what I'm trying to do is going around to different experts in different fields of biohacking and kind of highlighting, number one, the research, but also the practical application of it, and putting those basically into like video format. So they'll be on my website that I'm creating. It's called Biohack MD. And then on YouTube, just search for Biohack MD and they're going to be up there. I think they're up there. Most of them are there already. Everything's free. It's just for people to get the information from the source. Yours is going to be up there, I think, today. Yeah. Hope people like it.
Awesome. I'll definitely put a link to that and also post about it when it's out. So I'm looking forward to catching it and following the rest of your high fat experiment and future ones that you guys have in store. And I think the analysis on all that's going to be really interesting, and also just, contributing to all this knowledge coming out for people to enhance their health and biohack and everything. So thanks for making yourself a guinea pig and stuff so we can all watch and learn.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And thank you also for everything that you're doing, really kind of pushing the envelope. I think it's really taking, a combination of obviously doctors, but also researchers, and then also just people who are saying, hey, you know what? I want to see what this does to my body, experimenting with it, and then basically sharing that information with people so that other people who coming into the space not really knowing what to do have like a base of information to say, okay, well, I look more like Vanessa, so I have more of her experience. Let me try what she's doing because I think it'll be better for me versus somebody like, me or, Ted Naiman or Sean Baker. We're very, very different. Number one, genetically, we have different ancestors, different DNA makeup. So not one size fits all, I think, is really kind of the focus that I'm trying to push out there. Figure out what works for you. And then within that, realize that things are going to change. You have to adapt. You have to figure out, how to really augment things in your life to improve yourself so that you're not only living longer, but you're feeling fantastic. Because I don't want to live to 100 years old feeling horribly. I want to live to 100 feeling fantastic, having energy and all the things that come with it. And I'm sure you do too.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that we've always thought of aging as, just this gradual degradation of all of our systems and everything, but we're living in a time when all this technology is becoming available and, maybe growing old doesn't have to be the same as it was for past generations. And I think in our lifetimes, it's going to be very, very different, especially with the rise of health tech and biohack and all these different techniques and things. It's, you look at people out there who are in the space, like Mark Sisson, and you're like, wow, like you make getting older look awesome. And you make it, instead of it being something to dread or, not look forward to. And I always talk about how much I love getting older. And a lot of it's been because of keto and biohacking. Like I feel better than I ever did when I was in my early 20s, and I'm 35. I feel fantastic. I love getting older and getting wiser. But at the same time, like my health is better than it's ever been. So how cool is that? That we could do that, but also not have to face all of these modern diseases that, afflict so many people in our lives and have, to this date that we can continue to build muscle, like enhance our lifestyle and have more energy and all these things. It makes the future look really bright.
Yeah, definitely. It's an exciting time. I'll just end kind of by saying that my experience, so before I really kind of went into the field of health from prevention standpoint, I worked as a hospitalist working in hospitals. And part of my work was working in nursing homes, working with hospice and seeing kind of the end of life of a lot of people. And that to me is the most terrifying thing, is not necessarily dying, but living elderly, sick, unable to know like your family, really being afflicted by Western diseases like dementia, Alzheimer's, not being able to live functionally. To me, that's terrifying. And so I really want to focus on, like you, getting, aging is not an issue for me. It's being healthy, being able to interact with grandchildren, being able to really be as functional as possible for as long as possible. And I think everything that you and I are kind of researching and experimenting with and implementing into our life and kind of bringing that to the public is really geared towards that goal, being healthy as you age. And like you, I mean, I'm going to be 40. I feel fantastic. I feel, better than I ever have.
That's awesome. That's so great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, John, for another regular appearance on the show. It's been so great to get your expertise and feedback on all these different topics, and we'll be watching the rest of your experiment with interest.
Awesome. Thank you, Vanessa. It's always a pleasure. I love your podcast. So keep up the great work.
Thanks so much, John. I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode as much as I enjoyed recording it. It was such a blast to talk about so many of these important topics in the keto space. I hope that a few of them provided some insight for you, whether it came to insulin levels, ketone levels, testing, gut healing, the whole discussion around glutamate, MSG, and putting collagen in your coffee, which I find really, really interesting. And the latest experiment that Jimmy and Dr. Limansky are doing, as well as my carnivore trial. All of these fun things we got to chat about today and more. So I hope that you guys really enjoyed the episode. And if you are interested in trying out the ketogenic diet, check out the 28-day Ketogenic Girl Challenge. It's at ketogenicgirl.com. And it includes my support and coaching along with 28 days of meal plan plans that tell you exactly what to eat, when to eat it, pretty much, and includes shopping lists and tons of information on testing for ketosis, how to do it, exactly how to interpret the results. And I get to hold your hand all along the way in our fantastic Facebook group for the 28-day challenge. We have so many wonderful members in the group that are there sharing their successes and results and challenges as well, and supporting each other. I love being in our challenge group, and I know that you would love being in there too. So check it out at ketogenicgirl.com, the 28-day Ketogenic Girl Challenge. And until next time, have a fat-fueled rest of your day.